On explaining that hydraulic fracturing has a negative impact on the environment. I plan on doing this through two major claims. The first one is that hydraulic fracturing leads to the contamination of local water sources, and my second one is that hydraulic fracturing leads to an increase in greenhouse gas emissions that are released into the atmosphere. Just a little background on hydraulic fracturing, also called fracking, is that it's just the process of using pressurized water mixed with some sand and some chemicals. They shoot it in the ground, break up the rock, and pull out the natural gas. And the real controversy, coming back to my first point, is that when it's shot into the ground, the water can leak. So the fracking leads to contamination of local water sources. It seeps out through the wells underground. According to ProPublica, an independent nonprofit news group, more than 1,000 cases of contamination have been documented by courts, state, and local governments in Colorado, New Mexico, Alabama, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. And these are all states where hydraulic fracturing is very prevalent. To give an example of what can happen, a house in Brainbridge, Ohio contains such high levels of methane from fracking in their residential well that the house actually exploded on December of 2007. The News Herald of Northern Ohio reported, Thelma Payne, who lost her home of 52 years on the night of December 15th, when gas seeped into her well water and blew the house off its foundation as she and her husband were asleep inside. Now, luckily, nothing happened to the family, but it just shows you how much gas actually seeped into their well and how big of a leak that actually occurred. But the damage wasn't just limited to the house. The whole neighborhood was actually affected. A neighbor reported that they still have 100% gas reading level. And what that basically means is the water in the area was so toxic and so contaminated that it was undrinkable. And the fracking company, OE, actually had to deliver water to each individual house on a weekly basis so they had something to drink. And so you might be asking, what sort of chemicals are they using in fracking? And that's a big problem, is that they are secret. They're a formula, just like what's inside Coke or what's inside Pepsi. But according to the Bureau of Land Management, they believe that there are over 300 chemicals used in the fracking fluids, and that 65 of those are considered hazardous by the US government. And so, after all this water is shot in the ground, it comes back up, and that's called flowback. And what you do with it there becomes another problem. They put it in these giant temporary pits, and while it's in these pits, they leak if it rains too much, or if there's a hole, or it can seep into the ground. And again, in the same ProPublica article, in February 2008, 1.6 million gallons of flowback water was it seeped out from one of these pits and mixed with the local Colorado water that was used in residential taps. And so after the pits, it's either the flowback water is stored in underground salt aquifers that people don't drink, but again, that brings you back to the first problem where it seeps into the ground, or they send it through wastewater treatment plants. But according to a study done by the World Watch Institute, they found that treatment facilities can't handle the salt levels of flowback water, and then that even after it's been treated, it still has high particulate material in it. And that doesn't sound like a big deal, but according to the EPA's website, an organism placed in water with a high concentration of solids will shrink because of the water in its cells will tend to move out. And just basically due to the biology of this, this causes the microorganisms to either sink too low in the water or float too high, causing them to die. So it can actually have a very bad effect on the local life. So this brings me to my second point, that hydraulic fracturing releases harmful greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So when the flowback water comes back to the top of out of the ground, it comes with a large amount of methane, and methane is a proven greenhouse gas. Robert Howarth and Antony Ingraffa are two biology professors at Cornell, and they published a paper that found hydraulic fracturing actually releases 30% more methane than non-fracking methods of retrieving natural gas out of the ground. They also determined that the natural gas retrieved from fracking has a much larger carbon footprint than the standard forms of oil. This is because 1.9% of all of the gas brought out of the well will be lost to the atmosphere in the form of methane. And you might be asking, how bad is methane as a greenhouse gas? Again, according to the EPA, methane has over 20 times the global warming potential as the carbon dioxide that comes out of our cars. Now, there's not as much of it in the atmosphere because it's not as readily released, but it's much, much stronger. So it's a serious problem. Okay. So I hope after hearing this, you guys would agree that hydraulic fracturing has a negative impact on the environment because fracking leads to contamination of local water sources, and it also releases harmful greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Thank you.
All right, William, the claim is clearly stated. The secondary points are laid out well. They're also stated as claims, so that works pretty clearly. I like the background information explaining some of the concepts that you're talking about, and it helps connect, for instance, on the first point, that flowback issue to water contamination. I think there's a little bit of an explanation there. Excuse me. You've got, to me, the really convincing information on that first point where you're talking about contamination of the water is that there is, in fact, court cases where this seems to have been determined and liability has been assessed, I guess, against the fracking companies. And the example where the one company has to ship in the water to the local community seems like it's a tacit acknowledgement that the water is, in fact, problematic and that they were responsible for it. We might want a little bit more data about the context that's going on there to make sure that the example that you're describing there is accurate. But as presented, it seems like it's pretty convincing there. I thought that there was some good information about the amount of water that's contaminated. The contaminants, that they are potentially problematic. That's one of those things that I would think we need some more independent information on. You mentioned, well, there's the formulas and it's a secret sort of thing about what the contents is, but we should find from the water that's contaminated what the contaminants are, and so we ought to have information on that, and we ought to have some data that shows that it's had some kind of impact. And I didn't hear anything like that. It's just that there are these particulates there that are potentially problematic. The explanation about how the particulate matter might be affecting the microorganisms in the water, I didn't think that was explained very clearly. I guess there's an assumption that the microorganisms in the water are part of the natural environment that have some particular beneficial effect, and that this changes the way that they float higher or lower. I don't know what that ends up meaning. How is that important? Who is affected by that except the microorganisms in some place where the water isn't being utilized anyway, except in the seepage issue. So that, I think, doesn't get developed quite as much as it needs to. But you did a very good job citing your sources in the presentation and trying to qualify them for us. And I thought that you did a nice job in delivering it, and I thought there was a good summary at the end as well. Thank you.